Welcome to the CRLA training in communication. In this video, you will learn about the importance of communication, the ways in which we communicate, barriers to effective communication, how to listen effectively, and dealing with conflict. Let's begin. Communication is something we've done all our lives to the point where we hardly think about it. It's the process by which we send and receive messages, the way in which we learn, interact with each other, develop skills, have relationships. To put it bluntly, communication is life. Without it, we simply could not exist. We wouldn't be able to make it in society without this ability. You'd think, since we've been doing it all our lives, we'd be really good at it by now. And we are certainly good enough communicators to get through the day. But we can always improve our skills to learn to be more effective communicators. And as tutors, good communication skills are critical. Let's look first at how messages are sent and received. In this model, you can see that for communication to occur in any situation, certain things must be present. You must have at least two communicators, one to formulate and send the message, the other one to receive and decode the message and send their response to that message back to the first communicator. The means, or channel, of sending that message could be anything: face-to-face, text message, phone call, email, Skype, and each communicator is attempting to frame the message in a way that the other person will understand it. However, things always get in the way of complete understanding. For instance, each communicator has their own unique individual frame of reference, and it's based on their knowledge and experience of the world, so no two people are going to see things in the exact same way. That can cause misunderstandings. Also, the jagged line down the middle of this illustration represents something that is always present, even if we don't want it to be: interference, also known as noise. Interference is anything that gets between the communicators and makes the message more difficult to understand. There are several types of interference. Some reside within us, and there are also external sources. Internal noise can be either psychological or physiological. Psychological noise, that's the thoughts that run through our head and distract us so that we have difficulty paying attention to the message. For instance, if you're in a class listening to a lecture, but you're angry at your significant other, you may very likely be thinking about your anger rather than truly paying attention to the teacher. It can also be physiological. For instance, if you're sick, tired, or hungry, that may make it more difficult to concentrate on listening. External sources of interference are more obvious. Loud sounds like talking or construction noises, or people walking in and out of the room, maybe too much ambient noise, those kinds of things, but they can be equally distracting. Then we have semantic noise. This is due to the inherent ambiguity in language. A certain word or phrase may mean one thing to one person and something different to another person. Misunderstandings can easily result from this. For instance, if English is not your first language, you might be confused when someone invites you to a restaurant to get some chicken fingers. Chickens don't have fingers, so unless you've heard of this dish before, you could be very confused. As you can see, there are many ways that we can have difficulty sending and receiving messages. Sometimes I'm surprised we understand each other at all. And if that wasn't enough, here are some other barriers to effective communication. Ethnocentrism. This is when we are under the impression that the particular group with which we most identify is somehow better than members of other groups. We have a tendency to pay more attention to those with whom we identify. Egocentrism. Listening more closely to things that we believe affect us and ignoring things we don't think are important. Jumping to conclusions. Drawing a conclusion about something someone says without hearing them out, or basing our opinion on something besides the message, what they're wearing or how they look, for instance. Impatience, not wanting to wait for someone to get to the point. Lack of courtesy can be related to impatience. It's just not giving basic human courtesy to another communicator. Boredom, not wanting to be there, daydreaming. And motivation. If we have no reason to listen, we often don't listen, at least not very carefully. It's not only words that convey our message. In fact, a lot of our meaning comes from what's called nonverbal communication. As you can see by this chart, there are lots of ways that we communicate nonverbally. Take a few seconds and look at each of these and try to figure out how gestures, facial expressions, and even your appearance might add meaning to the words you use. It might emphasize the words, or it might actually change their meaning. For example, if you say, "I'm very angry with you right now," but while you say it, you're smiling and winking at the person you're talking to, it means something entirely different than the words alone would mean, doesn't it? As you can see, nonverbal communication is equally important as the words you choose to use. In fact, if the words a person says don't match their nonverbal signals, the listener tends to believe the nonverbal signals over the words themselves. Since it's so important, let's look at a few ways we can improve our use of and understanding of nonverbal communication. Pay attention to nonverbal signals. They are a critical part of the message. You'll need to look as well as listen to others when they're speaking, because their nonverbal behaviors mean a great deal. And when you're speaking, you need to be aware of your own body language and facial signals. Eye contact and a genuine smile are always good. If the words and the nonverbal signals don't match, that means something. Consider how the meaning of the words is affected by incongruent nonverbal behaviors. Make sure the tone of your voice is in keeping with the message. People can pick up on subtle things that may slip into your communication, like annoyance or frustration, so be careful. Eye contact is very important. It will help you catch those nonverbal messages. It also lets the student know that you care about them and are paying attention. If you're not sure what someone means based on their nonverbal signals, you can certainly ask for clarification. The context or the situation in which the message is sent can affect the message, so be aware of that. Also, you need to be aware that signals can be misinterpreted, so clarification, as I said before, may be necessary. And as with anything else in life, practicing makes perfect. Practicing using effective, congruent nonverbal signals, as well as practicing interpreting them, will help you become a more effective communicator. Listening is a critical component of communication. I like the saying, "You have 2 ears and only 1 mouth," so that you can listen twice as much as you speak. Listening involves not just our ears, but our eyes, so we can see the nonverbal behaviors that go along with the words. We listen far more than we talk, but that doesn't mean we listen effectively. Just because you can hear someone talk doesn't mean you're listening to them. We don't have to do much to hear, but we must actually choose to truly listen. How much we listen determines whether our listening is passive or active. Passive listening is little more than simply hearing. We listen passively when we believe there isn't a good enough reason to listen more carefully. We can listen for enjoyment, such as listening to the television or the radio, or half listen to someone talking. And have you ever half listened to a friend, a child, or maybe even your significant other? You know you do it all the time. But how do you feel when you realize it's being done to you? It doesn't feel very good, does it? There are certainly times when passive listening is perfectly acceptable, but generally speaking, a tutoring session is not the time to listen passively. On the other hand, active listening takes commitment. You have to realize that this message is important enough to pay attention to. This kind of listening takes effort. You need to make the commitment to try to understand both the meaning and the feeling behind the speaker's words. It can be really hard work, but it's necessary. So, how can we be better, more effective listeners? Well, remember that you should listen far more than you speak. Pay attention to the speaker. Don't jump to conclusions about where they're headed with their message and try to finish their sentence for them. Let them finish. If they ask a question, try to answer that question with a statement instead of asking another question. Now, if you need more information in order to understand their message, a question might be okay. But as a general rule, don't answer a question with another question. Remember that we all have our own frame of reference, and that can lead to biases and stereotypes. Everyone has them. but understanding that they exist and attempting to listen despite them is critical to learning more effective listening skills. Do your best not to get sidetracked by your own thoughts when others are talking. Once you realize that this is a common occurrence, it may become easier to pull yourself back to the moment and listen. As tutors, we often spend a lot of time explaining things. That's fine as long as you're not dominating the conversation. You need to allow the student to express themselves. Make sure that you're not formulating your response while they're talking, because that makes it more difficult to listen well. You don't have to jump in and correct them while they're speaking. In fact, it's better to wait until they are done before you provide feedback. Let's move on to something that takes good communication skills to handle well: conflict management. Dealing with conflict can be difficult, but if you understand how people communicate and how miscommunications occur, you may be better able to handle conflict that may occur in the tutor-student relationship. This chart illustrates different people's conflict styles. Conflict occurs when one person's concerns interfere with or clash with another's concerns. As you can see, different people in different situations have different responses to this interference. Some people compete or fight and try to win. Others avoid conflict and simply pretend it's not happening. Still others accommodate and just let the other person have their way, even if it puts them in a bad position. There are times when these things may be an appropriate response. For instance, if you determine that something is simply not worth fighting over, letting the other person have their way is probably fine. However, collaboration, finding a solution that makes everyone a winner, and compromise, where nobody gets exactly what they want, but everyone gets at least some of what they want, are usually the best responses to most conflict. If you can make everyone a winner, or help them to find a middle ground where everyone gets at least something, that's a great outcome. You're going to run across difficult people in tutoring. Your best bet is not to compete with them and try to one-up them, and it's usually impossible for a tutor to avoid an issue with a student if one arises. It's best to try to understand the problem from their perspective so that you can work towards collaboration or compromise. One of the main reasons that conflict can occur is illustrated here. People can have different opinions about the very same thing. From one person's perspective, it looks like there are 4 bars. From the other person's, there are only 3. They're both looking at the same thing, but they see it completely differently. As a tutor, you may be explaining something from your perspective, but the student may argue that you're not helping because you're not seeing the problem the same way they see it. You may need to stop looking at it from your perspective and try to see the problem from their point of view. Here's another example of how people often see things differently. When you look at this image, do you see a woman's face or a man playing a saxophone? Can you see both now that I've explained that? Once you see both sides of an issue, you may be able to help people who are arguing about that issue to see the other person's side. You may need to have the student explain to you how they see the problem. You might be surprised at what they see as the issue, but once it's clarified, you can help them deal with it. Let's take an example of something that might happen in a tutor-student interaction. You're working with a student and explaining a principle or theory that you think will help them with an assignment. You see them looking confused and possibly angry. You can interpret this in 2 possible ways: that they're angry because they don't think you understand what the problem is, or that they're frustrated because they still don't understand it, even though you've explained it. You might want to say something like, "You still look a bit confused right now. Am I explaining this in a way that you can understand? Is this the information that you need? Let me know." In summary, we've discussed how important communication is. You've learned the basics of how it works and how we sometimes misunderstand each other. You've discovered some ways to be a better listener and to try to look at things from a student's perspective. Think about this. How might you incorporate this knowledge into your tutoring sessions? Have you experienced communication problems with a student in the past? How might you use this information to respond differently to the situation? Remember, we can always improve our communication skills. This concludes the CRLA Communication Training video.